Opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one.
I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before.
You know, Wobbles, I'm kind of mad at you.
And as a reasonable man, I'm willing to do whatever's necessary to find a peaceful solution to these problems.
All right, well, welcome to episode 2 of the Punching Up movie podcast, where two long-standing friends and movie lovers take issue with films that have classic status or cult classic status or are just extremely popular. And so this week we are Punching Up is dealing with a film that's literally about punching. It's Raging Bull. So before we sort of go into what either mine or Damian's or both of our sort of issue is with the film, we're going to do a little so we don't assume context, we don't assume knowledge of the film. So we're just going to do a little bit of preamble about, you know, the making of the film and what the film is. So, Damian, how would you describe the plot of Raging Bull?
A brutal biopic about the life of boxer Jake La Motta from 1941 to 1964, charting his journey from like contender through to champion through to post-boxing life.
Yeah, and his focusing on his downfall, because, you know, in between the fights, there's a sort of downward spiral where he can't switch off, you know, the things that make him a great fighter, which is ability to take punishment and an incredible amount of aggression, and mix that in with a lot of sexual jealousy. It results in this sort of sequence, this repeated sequence of beating up his wives, and then ultimately turning on the one person who's kind of with him through thick and thin, which is his brother, who's played by Joe Pesci. So that's the plot in a nutshell. It's quite a simple plot. It's quite a complex film. Yeah. So Raging Bull comes at an interesting point in Martin Scorsese's career. So he sort of, you know, he starts off making sort of short films, like Italian American, and then sort of, you know, makes a sort of exploitation film for Roger Corman, Boxcar Bertha, and then that leads to Mean Streets, which, you know, is a sort of semi-autobiographical film about sort of gangsters and Catholics in Little Italy, and that kind of that launches him, and establishes him as a real sort of one to watch. And he sort of follows that up, not immediately, but he follows it up with Taxi Driver, which is this sort of incredible study of isolated ticking bomb in the sleaziest parts of New York, you know, and it's his second movie with Robert De Niro. And then he makes The Last Waltz, doesn't he? In the middle of all of that, concert film with the band. And then he makes New York, New York. And New York, New York is a passion project about a saxophonist played by Robert De Niro and his relationship with Liza Minnelli. And it absolutely tanks at the box office. At this point, he's clocked up a lot of kind of commercial momentum and Oscar momentum, especially with Taxi Driver. And it's all pretty much wiped out by New York, New York. And Scorsese is basically a very low personal ebb. In the middle of all of this, he's having massive addiction problems. So he's got this enormous cocaine habit that results in him hemorrhaging blood. Ended up in hospital nearly dying. Yeah, out of his ears. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, apparently out of orifices. He was like bleeding out everywhere. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So out of his ears and every other orifice. And he's in a hospital. And running concurrent with this is Robert De Niro's obsession with the boxer Jake La Motta. Now he's given this book by Jake La Motta, his biography. And Jake La Motta inscribes in this book, I think something like, you know, Bobby, only you can play me and a whacked out version of my life. And so it's not a very well written book, and De Niro, but he's obsessed with what he can do with Jake La Motta, and, you know, the sort of themes of suffering and, you know, and sort of violence and this man at war with himself. And so he keeps pressing this book on Scorsese, and Scorsese's not really interested because he's not remotely into sports, definitely not into boxing. And then as he's in hospital, presumably as De Niro is visiting him in hospital, and he still insists on sort of saying, well, why don't you turn this into a book? And this coincides with into a film. Sorry, this book into a film, and this coincides with Scorsese deciding he's going to have one last. He wants to live. That's the important thing. And he starts addressing his addiction issues, and he thinks his career's done. So he thinks, oh, I've got nothing to lose. I'm probably never going to make another film in America again. So I've got the opportunity to make this movie, because De Niro at this point is kind of probably, would you say, Damien, is probably his apex as an actor and a star?
For sure.
Yeah, because this is the end of the 70s, and he's done, he's won an Oscar for Godfather II. He's done his 2 Scorsese movies, and he's done The Deer Hunter in the middle of all of that, and other stuff I've probably forgotten. And New York probably hasn't damaged him as much as it's damaged Scorsese. And so he sort of throws in with De Niro, and he decides to just go for broke with this piece of filmmaking. And he's thinking, well, I'm probably never going to make another movie in America. If this fails, I'm going to go to France. I'm never going to come back, and I'm going to make small art house movies. So he just assembles this incredible team of collaborators. So the film's initially written, I'll just have to consult my notes, because he's a writer that sort of gets a little bit left out of the sort of Scorsese dream team. Marduk Martin, who helped him write sort of Mean Streets and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And he writes the initial screenplay. De Niro's not happy with it, so De Niro brings in the screenwriter of Taxi Driver, Paul Schrader. And what Paul Schrader adds to the screenplay is more violence, too much violence, actually, because some of the stuff in the screenplay is like taken out, not filmed, because it's just too alienating early on in the movie. But the things he crucially adds are, La Motta in his autobiography just doesn't mention his brother at all, or because they'd had this massive falling out. If you see the film, you understand why they fell out, and so Schrader reintroduces the brother into the screenplay, makes him the crucial character, and adds the sort of postscript of Jake La Motta going to seed later in life, putting on loads of weight, becoming this abysmal, horrible, sleazy nightclub comic. And then they start shooting the movie. I think De Niro and Scorsese go away to the Caribbean, I think it is. Yeah. And they have 3 weeks where they rewrite the film and rework it. And then he brings Thelma Schoonmaker in as the editor, who he's worked with on Woodstock and has edited Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And then she just comes into her element as an editor, and they film it in black and white at the insistence of Scorsese's mentor, the director Michael Powell, and they just throw every sort of technical trick in the book, especially in the fight sequences, which are storyboarded to a T, and just filmed using this incredible sound design where every punch thrown is a completely different sound effect. And they use things like, did you know this, Damien? They use like the slowed down sound of an elephant. Yeah. To do an abstract version of De Niro's breathing after he's been punched and all of that sort of stuff, and much more stuff that we've got time to go into. The casting is amazing. They bring Joe Pesci on, who really clicks with De Niro. Joe Pesci discovers this swimsuit model called Kathy Moriarty at a nightclub, and Scorsese pours everything into this movie. It gets released. I think that the head of United Artists, after seeing it, I mean, we were talking last time in the previous episode about the reaction after the screening of 2001 was walkouts, silence, and jeering. And there was silence after this, but it was a different type of silence. And then the head of United Artists, I can't remember his name, turns to Scorsese, calls him an artist. The film's released, and what Scorsese calls his kamikaze filmmaking results in this incredible kind of critical and I think commercial success, and it's nominated for multiple Oscars, loses most of them controversially to Ordinary People, but not De Niro. And so De Niro,
or Schoonmaker, she wins for editing as well, doesn't she?
Yeah, she wins for editing, and she was incredibly nervous sort of making the movie, but what it does, I mean, you could argue that Robert Redford with Ordinary People wins the battle, but Scorsese wins the war, because this movie that was going to be his last movie that he throws everything into, establishes him, until this day as the great American auteur who someone's always going to throw money at, always going to allow to more or less do what he wants to do. And he's still out there today making movies that are sort of set in, I think his most recent movie was Killers of the Flower Moon, which hasn't come out at the time of recording. Has just done really well at Cannes. Is already being heralded as one of the best things he's done, and he's still working with De Niro. And I have an issue with the film, and I think, am I right thinking you may share this issue? So we're not going to be quite.
I did share this issue, but doing the research, I recanted that issue.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
We can go at it, can't we?
Yeah.
Can I say what the issue is?
Please.
I'm aware that I've just talked solidly, probably for
that's
about
okay.
5 minutes. Yeah. So, couple of quotes. Now, the problem for a lot of viewers with Raging Bull is it's relentlessly violent. Well, I mean, a lot of Scorsese films are relentlessly violent, but it's relentlessly violent, in terms of depicting Robert De Niro's relationship with women. I think he has 2 wives. He beats them both up. He ultimately turns on his own brother, and I think it may be the most disturbing scene in the film. Beats him up in front of his wife and children and stuff like that. And then he's alone, and that's kind of, the sort of the downward spiral is he sort of isolates himself and whatnot. I haven't got a problem with that as a storytelling device of depicting a man who, for all intents and purposes, was actually a lot worse than the film depicts him.
Yeah.
Even he admits that. There's a great Motta quote where he watched the film, was horrified. I mean, he was kind of all in. He initiated the film, turns to his wife at the time, and he had lots of wives, as you can understand. You can understand why you can't understand why people you can understand why he lost wives. You can't really understand why he got them, and especially later on in life. And he looks at his wife and he says, "Was I like that?" She goes, "No, you were worse," which is hard to believe watching the film, because he's pretty bad. I'm going to read a Barry Norman quote, and this Barry Norman quote is from his 100 best films of the century book, and he says, De Niro, who took dedication to his craft as far as to put on 60 pounds to play the older, fatter La Motta, is outstandingly good as a man in whom rage, frustration, and bewilderment struggle for supremacy. Not a likable man, perhaps, but one ultimately deserving of our sympathy and even pity. And I think that's what the film sort of has to hinge on. He is a dark, dark man. He's a man who, sort of kind of has it all in terms of his career, and then at every point absolutely burns his bridges, scorches the earth around him, and destroys everything that's of value to him that he doesn't seem to put that much value in, to be honest. And my issue with the film, and I have to say, I think this film is a masterpiece. I think it's an astonishing movie, brilliantly made. Robert De Niro, it's hard to argue with him getting the Oscar. It's a phenomenal performance. But I would argue that maybe he does his job too well. And there's nothing remotely to latch onto about La Motta that it even makes you feel the pity and sympathy that Barry Norman suggests the film achieves. And so it kind of takes me out of the movie because he's so unremittingly unpleasant and nasty. What do you think?
Yeah, he is. So I've got this quote from Scorsese, which kind of talks about that. He says, "We found trying to tell the story from the beginning as a young man, because when they were first putting it together, they had the beginning section as him as a young child, and lots of explaining how he came to be who he became." It says it just sucked in a kind of old-fashioned way of making movies and writing stories, because it made the audience feel at ease, because everything about the characters in the film is explained. So you'd feel, okay, he came from a bad neighborhood, he became a thief in order to survive, and now we understand that it makes everybody feel good in a way and go home, and kind of makes them stop thinking about him. And the idea was we wanted to make it more powerful in doing him as a human being, accept him as he is or not accept him, and not rely on antiquated ideas of motivation, because nothing's that simple. And then it gets to the end of the film, we're fast forwarding a little bit, and the quote is the biblical quote from the Gospel according to John, whether or not he is a sinner, I do not know. All I know is this: once I was blind and now I can see. Or now I can see. And when they were in the Caribbean, De Niro and Scorsese, they would just, as they were doing passes over the script, they were just stripping back all that explanation, stripping it back, and kind of showing him as a person from this time to this time, and allowing the viewers to just experience him viscerally. And I get that. When I heard that quote that he said in the commentary, I was like, yeah, I understand. There are so many films that over-explain or explain. There's literally like zero psychology in this film, apart from what you see on the screen. And your interpretation of the psychology is really up to you. So I kind of get it. I get it. I think that it might have detracted had they put in more of the reasoning why he was such a brute. You know, how he was brutalized by his dad when he was young. He did like backroom. His dad made him do backroom bar fights for like pennies that when he was 8 years old, that his dad kept most of the money for. Apparently at one point his dad when they were young, his dad went out onto the porch, let a gunshot off, and came back in and said, Santa just committed suicide. You know, obviously, yeah, those kind of things do explain how he is. As you said, the book maybe wasn't written very well, and probably not as incisive as it could have been, being as it was written by him. I haven't read the book. Have you read the book?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't read the book. I remember when we were at drama school, a guy I shared a house with who was kind of obsessed with La Motta, and De Niro had read the book and did make the point that the book was far more disturbing than the film, that there was so much stuff that they'd sort of excised. But that's not really my issue. I don't need sort of necessarily someone's background being explained. I'm quite happy being dropped into the middle of someone's life and sort of figuring out the context and sort of figuring out by inference what may or may not have made him like that. Or I don't even really need to explain. My riposte to that would be Taxi Driver. So Taxi Driver plops us into the middle of a man who has you've only got his explanation of himself. He doesn't really explain himself, and he's an unreliable narrator. And he's a ticking bomb, and he's played by exactly the same actor, and it's got, to an extent, the same writer, the same director. So it's almost like the same team working on this character. And Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver is more disturbed and more dangerous than Jake La Motta, because this guy is effectively a murderer. You know, he's this guy looking for people to kill, looking for some kind of righteous framework to explode at because he needs to kill, you know, for whatever reason. And that's not really explained. It's not explained who he is. There's inferences that he might have been in Vietnam, but we don't know. All we know about him is what he tells us in his diaries, and that's not necessarily reliable. And the scenes that should really kind of distance you from him, like when he goes on a date with Sybil Shepherd and he takes her to a porn cinema, and it seems like in his own mind he doesn't see why that would be the worst date that he, you know, and you know, and obviously he has this very protective fascination with Jodie Foster, who's like a sort of child prostitute, and you can argue that the violence is always sort of directed at people who sort of deserve it, like Harvey Keitel's pimp, and you know, the mugger that he killed. Does he kill a mugger? I can't remember if he kills a mugger. Or, yeah, you know, it's been a while since I've seen the film. It's been a while. And so that sort of mitigates against the kind of revulsion that you might feel for him, because La Motta, when he's not beating people up in the ring, he's beating women up, or he beats his brother up. But he's a deeply disturbing character in Taxi Driver. Yeah, there's something about him that makes you pity him, and makes you kind of want to go on this really dark journey with him. Whereas,
do you think that is? Sorry to interrupt. Do you think that is because he's so protective over Jodie Foster? Like, I
think so. Yeah.
You know, that's quite a key bit. Whereas in Raging Bull, you don't really have anything to latch onto with Jake La
No.
Motta, do you? There's not one moment where you think, okay, because the only bit of moral sort of high ground that he has is that he doesn't want to work with the mob. He doesn't want to throw fights. That's the only thing you have. Otherwise, everything else is quite repugnant, right? His behavior.
But that's another manifestation of the thing that causes him to beat his nearest and dearest. It's pride, isn't it? He has this incredible pride, and I suppose the nearest he comes to integrity is his the fact that no one's knocked him out. So it's got a really disturbing sequence, brilliant sequence where Sugar Ray Robinson absolutely smashes him to bits, and his response is, "You never put me down," and Sugar Ray Robinson's response is like, "Who are you? So what? You're a lunatic." And he doesn't throw fights. He doesn't work with the mob until he has to, and that triggers like the most self-loathing, more than any punishment he visits on. Except his brother. I think he feels real shame about his brother, and that really sort of sad sequence where he's trying to reconcile with his brother. His brother doesn't want anything to do with it. I think there's elements by which in Taxi Driver you see two ways it could go, because in the first half he's gearing up to kill a president. He seems to need to rescue women, and in the first half it's all about his obsession with Sybil Shepherd, and then he's gearing up to, and she works as a campaign manager, doesn't she, for a local politician, and he's clearly gearing up to kill the politician, and then that's thwarted. And then in the second half he sort of takes all of that psychopathology and diverts it towards ostensibly on paper a more righteous cause, which is rescuing a young girl from a pimp who arguably doesn't want to be rescued, and so you've got that. That's a weird thing. She seems to have that she seems to kind of quite have this strange sort of Stockholm syndrome attachment to her pimp. And so I think you're right in that there's elements, it's probably a subtler character in that sense, because you go on his journey, you see things from his point of view, and you have to step back from the film to see just how he's just a ticking bomb looking for a righteous excuse to unleash all this anger, and it just happens to be Taxi Driver. Whereas
go on.
Whereas I think the thing that disturbs me about Jake La Motta is I don't think, unless I'm very, very unlucky, I would ever find myself with a Travis Bickle. You might do, but you wouldn't necessarily be aware of it. Whereas, I think we've all met to a greater extent a La Motta, a guy that you sit in the room with and you watch what you say, and because they're violent, and they, there's a certain charisma about them, but there's a constant tension about them, and I don't know if that's something that slightly takes me out of the movie, but I think you've got, we talked about this in the sort of preparatory discussions about this. If you compare, and it's a bit of a strange thing to do, if you compare comparable characters to La Motta, and there's two that we talked about. There's Ray Winston in Nil By Mouth, and then there's Tamura Morrison's sort of Maori gang leader in Once Were Warriors, and these are both guys who visit horrific violence on their partners. Yet you kind of understand in both of them why Kathy Burke, in spite of everything that he does to her, why she might go back to him. And you have those moments. And admittedly, Once Were Warriors is a little bit more of a schematic film, isn't it? It's more of a movie. But you see those beautiful sequences where Tamura Morrison's with his family and they're relaxing and they're singing a song together that they all, and it's like this little, and you see why his violence might attract people, because the first thing you see him do is just basically just destroy a barroom thug that's come in and disrupted the peace of his little den, his little bar that he kind of holds court in. And also both of those films are told from the points of view of the women as well. So there's automatically that sort of shift in perspective. And I think in terms of Raging Bull, it's brave. It's incredibly brave just to stick you in the middle of Jake La Motta, not really tell it from Kathy Moriarty's point of view, telling it from his point of view, and you're constantly given his point of view. And I think it's a brave film, but I think it's almost like De Niro does his job too well and distances you too. So it is a bit of an endurance test towards the end. And by the end, you're thinking, I just want to get out of this man's company. I don't want to stay in this man's company. and you don't have those heights. You don't get the sense that it's not really. I don't think it's a rise and fall film, because what does he achieve? His heights don't seem that high, and everything about his life seems grubby and base, and you know, he just seems to have lost before he's won. If that, you know, that makes sense. So I'm just rambling now. So please.
No, that's okay. Even when he wins the championship, you never really feel there's a celebration.
No.
You know, like as you say, it does just feel like a sort of downward spiral. This violent man destroying himself and everything about him. There's a quote that I read. Jonathan Demme had given Martin Scorsese a painting by a folk artist of Jake La Motta, and it said on it, "Jake fought like he didn't deserve to live."
Mm.
I thought that was quite, and then Scorsese says, you know, that's pretty much like I made a whole film about that, and this guy just wrote it in a line.
Yeah.
But it is kind of true, isn't it? Like, all he wants is to be the champion, like apparently. But when he becomes that champion finally, it's emptiness. There's no. I suppose it's probably like a lot of sports people who have this this drive to get to the top of the pile, and then when you get to the top of the pile, there's still you're still there. You're not different. You haven't suddenly been transformed into this champion, into this Olympian, into this great winner. There's still you and your demons. And
but why isn't that more tragic in the film? I think that's my issue with it. You see other films where it's tragic in The Godfather. You know, you see in over 2 Godfather movies, you see Michael Corleone, but you do see him morally degenerate subtly, don't you, by degrees? But by the end, he's all powerful, but he's on his own. You know, and he doesn't even necessarily realize or acknowledge or care that he's lost everything. You know, he's killed his brother. He
accepts the deal that he's made, right?
Yeah, and it seems almost like he accepts that, but you feel the tragedy of it. I'm trying to think of other examples. Well, you know, in at the end of Once Were Warriors, where you have, I realize we're giving away the ends of loads of these movies, but it's like, you know, you've got Tamura Morrison sort of sitting there on his own, waiting for the police to turn up, having lost everything, and there's a tragedy to it. You see how he's a king. You see how he's ultimately left with the part of his character that really drives him and overrides everything else, which is his violence. And you were saying, because I hadn't seen Nil By Mouth since it came out. I think in the 1990s, and I'd forgotten the end. I'd forgotten that, you know, that it ends with a kind of weird sort of reconciliation that might be the whole thing ticking over again. You know, so you've got that as well. That's that.
I mean, I suppose with Nil By Mouth, it's like it could be ticking over again, or it could be potentially like a new chapter.
Yeah, he's learned. Yeah, he's kind of he's seen who he is, and he's horrified by it. Yeah. But why isn't it? I think that's the thing. Why isn't it more tragic? Why don't I feel like the loss of Jake La Motta? Because I don't like him from the first.
I think that's the key.
From the get go, I don't like him. I don't think he deserves anything. He's from the first thing you see him in. I think it's almost within 10 minutes, he's just throwing his dinner at his wife, and, you know, complaining about her threatening to beat her up,
being cooked.
Yeah. Just and you just think, and then he's like threatening to kill his neighbor's dog, and you just think, can you imagine living in a block with a man like that? And at no point do you see even when he's like romancing sort of Kathy Moriarty's character, which is disturbing in itself, because they established, don't they, she's 15 years old, and he's like, I don't know, he's probably like 28 at the time.
Yeah.
And you don't see the charm in the man. You think this is creepy, this is sleazy. The character that and he's a deceptively dark character. The character that is the life of the film is your point of human contact, is Joe Pesci. And Joe Pesci, you think I could hang out with him, but he's
a reasonable man.
Well, but only by comparison to, you know, he's an appalling husband. You have that incredible scene, which I always remembered as being like a bit more provoked than it is, where he takes like Frank Vincent out, who just seems to exist in Scorsese films to be abused and destroyed by, because he's the same guy that actually kills for making a quip about him in Goodfellas, isn't it? So when he sort of demolishes him in a nightclub, it's sort of barely provoked, and you feel sorry for Frank Vincent, and so that's his horrific act, and he's a bad husband. He's like got his mistresses. He's like, but you like him. I think because he's played by Pesci, and I think there's a David Thompson quote where it talks about, it says De Niro resists charm, and I think and I think he's at his most charmless here. And he's utterly serving the character, utterly serving it. You can't fault him as an actor, but I don't feel the fall. I don't feel the tragedy of him going from, losing his family. I don't feel the tragedy. You think, good, they're well off without him. And you don't feel the tragedy of him destroying his body, just almost deliberately, because there's that injection of kind of Scorsese Catholic redemption through punishment.
All over it.
Which ultimately leads to damnation, because it's not a route to redemption. And he smashes his hands, doesn't he? Like, he takes his hands, which are the tools of his trade, smashes them in a police cell wall. Famously, which is what De Niro did. Sort of just lets his body turn to fat. And ends up just doing this sleazy, cheesy, horrible nightclub routine, essentially in a kind of very, very narrow strip joint. Come dive bar, but I don't feel the tragedy of it. I don't feel the fall. I think good. Let's just leave you there in the gutter. I don't care about.
Well, especially when at the in his nightclub, he then procures that 15-year-old girl that he then goes to prison for. There's still no redemption. It's not like he's turned into somebody. It's not like he's learned his lesson. He's still he's still trying to be. Trying to find adulation, trying to find fame, trying to not even fame, but like he wants to be loved by his audiences, and he is a bit of a sleazeball. Like I saw a David Letterman interview with him, the real Jake La Motta, maybe a year or a couple of years after, and he's just a bit cheesy. Like he is in the film. He is that sort of cheesy guy. So he'll say a few little, cheesy, funny lines that are just not funny. And like, obviously David Letterman, he's not laughing if it's not funny. And you can clearly see it. He's a guy from a different generation trying then to find his place. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. 100% hear what you're saying. I don't feel the tragedy. I think De Niro does resist charm. Here's a question: what film is De Niro charming in?
In his comedies, I mean, it's not the most laudable part of his career. Meet the Fockers. Analyze This.
I was thinking Analyze This, actually.
In a weird sort of way, I think he's charming because he's a bit adrift. I think he's charming in Jackie Brown. He's kind of weirdly lovable. So that when he does the horrible things he does, it's tragic, and you see that in Samuel L. Jackson's reaction to what he does and what Samuel L. Jackson has to do as a consequence. So I think, but he's framed by other actors. It's a supporting role. He's compelling. I'm trying to think. I'm not.
What about his earlier roles? Like those are all older roles where maybe he's mellowed out. But I don't know if there is much charm in his. It's kind of a fake Bradaccio. What's that word?
Bragocchio.
Yeah. Pinocchio. It's a in Mean Streets.
Yeah, well, I think I find him really irritating in Mean Streets. I think he's brilliant, but it's like you wouldn't want to be in that guy's. He's on all the time. You wouldn't want to be in that guy. And also he's gonna wreck every party you're at. He's gonna be the guy that provokes a fight all the time.
Yeah,
you see why some people find he's not charming. He's purposefully not charming in The Deer Hunter. He's like, there's a horrible bit that this scene where he's basically kind of berating. But he's not supposed to be. He's not supposed to be charming in Raging Bull. But his purpose is different.
Charming in Once Upon a Time in America. He's not.
No.
I mean,
but it's interesting how they match him with people who are. They match him in Once Upon a Time in America with James Woods and Joe Pesci turns up as well, and he's surrounded by Walken, who's he is
in
charming
spades,
actually walking up.
really.
I'm not sure he's not
Yeah.
charming in that, but he's compelling in a different way. And John Savage, and yeah, so it's an ensemble piece. And obviously I've not seen New York, but they're pitching him against Liza Minnelli and King of Comedy Jerry Lewis, who's I suppose is charming. I find quite irritating, but he's
same. But yeah.
But So I think what this thought's just occurred to me, and I think he's completely the wrong physical type. But what if Al Pacino had played beat for beat had played the same role? I mean, he's not physically. You can't imagine him turning himself into a middleweight boxer. He didn't have that build. I don't think. De Niro's a bit more solid. But obviously, these are the two guys that are going neck and neck with each other throughout the 70s. But simply by virtue of Pacino being Pacino, would it have been a different? Well, it would have been a different movie. But would you have felt the would you have felt the fall from grace, if there ever was any grace, a bit more if Pacino would have, or is that just ridiculous casting?
No. I think that's quite interesting because I'm thinking about, and I haven't seen it for so many years, but I think about John Voight in The Champ. And I don't really know, I can't really remember the film very much, but I'm thinking like any kind of other actor who would have played, or who has played a boxer in something like this, would another actor who had maybe a natural innate charm. I think that's the thing with Christopher Walken. You said he's not very charming he's not charming in Deer Hunter. You don't remember the charm. You remember the intensity and the kind of the blankness, don't you? You do, but you have the whole wedding sequence at the start. And I think that he's Meryl Streep's other half. There's a boyfriend, isn't he? I don't remember. It's been so long since I've seen it. That's good. We should rewatch that for sure. I don't have an issue with it, so we can't. No. Just for fun, I think. Unfortunately. I think he has charisma. I think there's certain. I don't know, like. I don't want to say, like, does he not have Brando? Of course, he's got. If you'd have dropped Brando from the 50s, and there's direct comparisons because obviously, La Motta, De Niro's La Motta at the end does. I could have been a contender speech, doesn't he? From On the Waterfront. If you drop Brando into it, you just transported him from whenever in the 50s, straight out of On the Waterfront into this. You'd have absolutely felt the pain, the tragedy, the fall. There's one bit in so at the end when he's doing the I could have been a contender, it's the end, isn't it, when he's doing the contender speech. Scorsese was saying they did about like 19 or so takes, and it was down between two different takes, and what Marty wanted was to strip out any kind of like acting or any kind of humanity, whereas there's another take that De Niro wanted, which was a little bit more emotive, and ultimately, I think what's helped the success of the Scorsese De Niro collaboration was that De Niro always deferred to Scorsese at the end. Like he never pushed the point, and in this he could have done, like as you said, he was probably at a higher point in his career than Scorsese was. And could have possibly pushed that, but didn't. And I think that leads into the taking away from, stripping back and taking away the psychology. So it is just said like as blandly as possible. And maybe that's what, obviously that's what he wanted, Scorsese wanted. It's and it works, here's a thought. Because I think a comparable performance actually from De Niro's sort of CV is The Irishman. In The Irishman, he's a character that alienates his family because he's a murderer. He's a kind of contract killer, kills his best friend, and you feel the tragedy when he gets towards the end of his life and he has nothing. And he's in a retirement home. All his friends are dead. And Joe Pesci's in it as well, so it invites all sorts of comparisons in a weird sort of way, and you have this charmless man who is committed to a lifetime of violence. I mean, he's a kind of mafia foot soldier par excellence, and at the end of his life, he gets you see the span of his life, don't you? And towards the end, he's just
this man in a retirement home, you know, confessing to a priest as much as he can. Maybe he finds God's forgiveness, maybe he doesn't. That's left up to you. But he's nothing. You know, he's nothing. You know, and like La Motta in a way, except he's more hollowed out. He has ostensibly less charisma than La Motta, but you feel the tragedy of it. You know, you feel the loss, and you don't with La Motta.
That brings me to thinking about the end of Once Upon a Time in America, where he goes and sees and realizes that James Woods is still alive, his best friend. And he said, you know, he wants him to kill him. He wants De Niro to kill Woods and pushes him by saying, you know, I took everything from you. You know, I took all these years. And you do feel the tragedy in that.
Yeah.
You do feel sorry for De Niro's character, I suppose, you know. Even though, again, he's quite charmless and he does horrific things within the film.
Oh, worse things to women.
Absolutely.
Yeah, worse things to women than he does in. Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know. I wonder if it's. I don't know. I don't know why that is. I don't know why. I mean, Sergio Leone obviously leans more. We're down the line in another episode. We're going to talk about Sergio Leone and you know. I think he leans more towards sentiment. You have that whole sequence before De Niro even turns up, where you've got the kids, so you know them as children. You've seen them as he's doing exactly the thing that Scorsese and De Niro refused to do. You see these people as kids, and you understand kind of like the journey from childhood, sort of Bowery boys style ragamuffins to you know, kind of mob bosses and murderers and psychopaths and whatnot, you know, and so there's that tragedy inbuilt, because you spend the first, is it like 40 minutes, hour of the film in the company of children. These, and so that does a lot.
And the music as well is very, it's very sweeping. It's very, you know, operatic. It has like a definite melodramatic feel to it, doesn't it?
And this isn't operatic, is it? It's almost going the opposite way. Because it's a tragedy without the traditional sort of ennobling elements that sort of prefigure the fall. And here's another thought: if Coppola had directed this, would it be a different movie? Because he's
for sure.
Yeah, obviously it'd be a different movie. But
would you
yeah, that's a stupid thing to say, but it was like from me. But it was, what I mean is, it was, if Coppola had directed it, you probably would have felt the tragedy more, because he's you know, he leans into kind of classical tragical tropes, doesn't he?
Also, I think the fact that Marty was balls deep in cocaine, his cocaine addiction at the time, it tends to probably dictates the kind of film that he's making, for sure, right? There is like a sort of coldness to it that, like, cocaine is really that, you know. It's not a nice warm drug. It's a cold sort of, you know, egotistical, maniacal drug. I want to talk about briefly about God's Lonely Men as well, Paul Schrader.
Yeah.
Briefly, but we'll get to that in a second. Sean Burns wrote an article about the film, and he said two quotes that I just thought were brilliant. He goes, "It's one of those uniquely 1970s movies that should come with a co-directing credit for cocaine."
What was because this is what I can't understand. Was Scorsese, he was off cocaine when he made the film, wasn't he? He just I
don't know. I think he was still. I don't think he'd shaken cocaine until afterwards. Maybe he'd had a little try to rehab. Maybe he wasn't on it while, but I don't think he was fully off it, as far as I'm aware.
There's a great. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
There's a great South Bank show interview with Melvin Bragg on the set of. It's either on the set or shortly after the making of Raging Bull, and he's interviewing Scorsese. Scorsese looks like the character he plays in Taxi Driver. He's got that real sort of devil beard, and his eyes are just like wired, and he looks like he's at any point he's going to pick up a bottle and smash it over Melvin Bragg's head, and he just looks wired and terrifying, you know. And he's talking in very theological terms with this kind of wired look in his face, you know, like, you know. So he's obviously sort of processing the film theologically, as he does with all of his movies, however ostensibly sort of removed from religious themes they seem. It's always a subtext of every one of his movies. So we can talk about God's Lonely Man now. It seems like a nice segue.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes. That's Paul Schrader for you, isn't it? I mean, and that links obviously Taxi Driver and La Motta in Raging Bull. What's your take on that?
Well, I've never really understood what. I mean, obviously, I am religious, so my head's in that headspace all the time. But I've never quite understood what Schrader means by God's Lonely Man. Is it a Dostoevsky quote or something like that? I think
possibly.
Yeah, because I don't know if it's like a sort of a man adrift, aware of God. I don't actually know what it means. I've never understood what Scorsese means by it. In the same way, I don't quite understand what they're trying to say with the quote from John, because obviously it's taken out of context, and it's very much a quote about the acknowledgement of messiahship of Jesus in the Gospel of John, and so I don't know what sort of illumination La Motta has. Once I was blind, now I can see, and unless it's like this self-realization that he's an absolute monster, and that's it. I don't know. There was a because it's recently been restored, which is why we're talking about it. We both saw it in different sides of the world, and it's 4K restoration. And over here in England, in the Guardian, Peter Bradshaw, the reviewer, kind of unpacks the quote from the Gospel of John, but it still doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't really know.
That section where it says whether or not he is a sinner, I do not know, is that seems to me to refer to the fact that they don't lay any judgment upon that Martin Scorsese doesn't lay a judgment upon Jake La Motta.
Which is confusing because the blind man's talking about Jesus. So that takes a real sort of like waltz with the actual script, completely out of context, as a quote that you have to just apply to the movie and just divorce any sort of biblical context from it. So I mean I understand and I'm fascinated with I think Schrader's relationship with his Calvinist past, because he almost went to the priesthood. Scorsese almost went to the priesthood. Scorsese sort of regained his belief, but would now, I would imagine, he would consider himself a devout practicing Catholic. Schrader's on a kind of more interesting journey where he seems to sort of be leaning a little bit more towards reconnecting with his Calvinism in films like First Reform, but you don't know. There's always that kind of ambiguity and sort of ambivalence about it, and I think when they come together, those two sort of theological positions are absolutely fascinating, just to see what ends up on screen, and on many levels very theologically confusing as well. And I find it hard to kind of try and like unthread the theology, if you like, of Raging Bull, because it seems to me just a movie like a very sort of Dante-esque levels of hell sort of movie, except he starts off in hell and just goes further and further and further down, and I think Taxi Driver is a bit more complex. I don't know what God's Lonely Man means.
Before toxic masculinity became a buzzword, we had Martin Scorsese movies. I thought that was another one by Sean Burns. I thought that was a great little quote.
I'm brilliantly done. I'm very honestly done, because it's like there are many more charmless, vicious men out there than there are charming, vicious men. So it's a risk. I think it's a laudable risk, and I sort of, like when we're talking about 2001, I was never in any doubt this movie is a masterpiece that deserves its place. Interestingly enough, I think it left the BFI top 100, because they do it every 10 years. It was one of the few. There were a few films that were kind of conspicuously kind of shunted out. Which in this day and age, there's a sort of distancing from films that even cover the subject. I don't think it's a problematic picture, because I don't think at any point you're kind of rooting for the wife beater. You're not, are you? But maybe it's just considered too much of a rough ride in today's climate, and it's just been, or I think there's a sort of downgrading about directors who are seen as overtly macho, because to my horror, and the Wild Bunch. There's no Peckinpah in AFI Top 100. The Wild Bunch is shunted out, and Moonlight is slotted in.
Yeah,
and it's just like the Wild Bunch is about like old, nasty, vicious, violent women, men, you know, and the only women in it are like basically Mexican prostitutes.
So Raging Bull was made black and white because Scorsese had found out that a lot of the color film was degrading.
Yeah,
this film would be a different film if it was in color. And
also, I think he liked the old black and white boxing movies. He didn't like boxing, but he liked the old black and white boxing movies, you know, like the Setup and Champion. I think I'm right in saying that he was quite influenced by, you know, Ouija, you know, the crime scene photographer.
Yeah.
And the Ouija, the Ouija photographs are astonishing, you know, and so he was a sort of fixture. He was a fixture at fights. Did some great photographs of fighters and great photographs of sort of, you know, fighting halls in Los Angeles, and you know, is even actually he has a cameo in the Killers, you know, the Burt Lancaster version of the Hemingway story. He's one of the photographers in the fight in the boxing sequence there. Yeah, he has like uncredited.
The Killers.
But and also I think one of the saving graces of it being shot in black and white is it probably makes the bloodletting a lot more palatable, because the blood's like black treacle, isn't it? And you know, you can get away with more bloodletting if the film's in black and white these days.
Yeah.
Because he clearly didn't have a problem with bloodletting. Oh no, he did. No, he's always had problems because they have to have that red filter over the end of Taxi Driver, wasn't it? That was a concession to stop it getting an X certificate. You know, when you do that overhead shot of the aftermath of De Niro's sort of rampage through the Hell's Kitchen brothel.
The dripping.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah, and you know, and yeah, because there's sort of blood everywhere. But so they put a sort of red filter to mitigate against the kind of splurting blood of, you know, the big gun battle at the end of Taxi Driver. So there's these interesting little, and I think this is probably just an accidental, you know, kind of benefit to the film that makes it a little bit more watchable if you've got a weak stomach. Or a sensitive stomach. Don't mean to make moral judgments on people's capacity to absorb domestic violence on film. It's not necessarily laudable quality to have a high tolerance for sort of domestic violence, but it's but I mean, you know, the domestic violence sequences aren't particularly bloody. It's the boxing scenes. The boxing scenes are very, very bloody, as boxing matches were.
I suppose you just remember, like, there's that cut, isn't there, where you just see the spurt of blood, and it like
and the blood dripping off the blood dripping off the ropes and whatnot.
Yeah, which hadn't he seen before, like from a previous fight or something? He'd seen some.
Yeah, I think he'd been to a couple of fights, and you know, and that was an image. And I've seen, and they're disgusting. I mean, I used to go to like boxing matches in Nottingham when the Nottingham middleweight Carl Froch was kind of fighting a lot. And I remember seeing there's a boxer, Herbie Hyde, get an eye cut. First time I'd actually seen a proper like eye cut. And I mean, I wasn't close enough to ringside. We couldn't afford those seats, and you know, we were like way back. But they put it up on the screen, and it's just this gash above his eye.
Yeah,
it's horrific.
The shot coming from the basement, following him, the Steadicam shot that goes all the way through the crowd into the ring, and then like dollies up a little bit. I hadn't noticed that was one shot before. And it was only watching the commentary that I was like, Shoemaker was talking about it, saying that apparently they had 10 different takes, and Marty knew which one he wanted. But then when she went to the editing suite, that one take was destroyed because of some reason. Wow. So she had to then go and tell him, because he was like, that's perfect, you know, that's the perfect one. But this was the second best one. But it's an incredible shot. And obviously, Goodfellas is famous for its going into the nightclub sequence with Henry and Karen, isn't it? You know, and whereas this, I'm watching it and I didn't notice it, you know? It looks great. Everything looks great.
I can't remember it.
Incredible film, really incredible.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. It's never been one of my sort of like rewatchable Scorsese's, but despite being like a boxing fan and a boxing movie fan, because it's not a boxing film. You know, it's not. It's ostensibly
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes to fights, and it's not really interested in how like the fight game works. And
they didn't want to do anything.
I promised my dad I would mention him in the podcast because this was a film that I didn't watch for ages. because my dad didn't like it. My dad was a big influence on me. Like, obviously, he still is, in terms of his recommendations. And he had a very good taste in cinema. He was a kind of mature student. He studied at Wimbledon College of Art. And he was part of a film club there. And he'd come back and tell me about Yojimbo. And he'd tell me about Kings of the Road, with Wim Wenders' film. He saw Eraserhead there. And then, well, this had nothing to do with the film club. He saw it with my mum. They went on a date, and he saw Raging Bull at the cinema.
I mean, clearly that's probably why I didn't like it, right? If it's not exactly a date film, is it?
Let's come and see this movie about a man beating his wife. They went to see it. I have to ask him why he went to see it. He went to see it, and he said there was something about the sound mix that just took him out of the film, and he just didn't like it. If my dad didn't like something, I just assumed I wouldn't like it. And then I think it was like I was probably in my 20s when I saw it the first time. And then thought, I disagree with my dad on this. So there we go.
Wow.
So shall we set up next episode? Wrap up. Yeah. So we've had two quite intense movies. Obviously, like the sort of the great lofty themes, metaphysical themes of 2001, and then we're down in the gutter with Jake La Motta. So we're going to lighten it up next time, and we're going to do a comedy, and we're going to punch up Mel Brooks with Young Frankenstein.
It's pronounced Frankenstein.
Another black and white movie made in the 1970s, comedy classic, heralded by many as the best thing Mel Brooks ever made, and I don't like it.
Yeah, great. So, I haven't seen it since probably the 1980s.
Yeah.
And have very, very little recollection of it, apart from Igor.
Marty Feldman.
It wasn't a film that I went back to and watched and went, yeah it's my favorite film. So
I like comedy, by the way. I do. I'm not a trasher of the noble art of comedy.
Yeah, I like comedy as well.
We like comedy. Let's sign off on that positive note. After an hour or so, stuck in the sewer with Jake La Motta, the Bronx.
Brilliant. Until next time.
Yeah, from Nottingham.
From Sydney. Peace.
The mission has been completed.
Groovy.